Thanks to Meta, Spencer, and to Brian Eelhart for their help, and to Emil for filming this, and especially to Science for Peace for hosting these vital discussions. A brief premise, although it's unfashionable in academe, I'm not ashamed to be an idealist. I still believe in, and will continue to believe in, developing better policies, institutions, and approaches. Why are we here tonight? Well, like it or not, we share an urgent need to address 4 to 5 long-standing challenges. Perhaps a few new ones as well, at least if we're to be ready and prepared for future crises. I'll claim that we have an idea that might help: a United Nations Emergency Peace Service. It's no panacea nor any cure-all by any means. In my opinion, it's simply a better option, more rapid, more reliable, likely more effective, cost-effective than what we've seen to date. As is the norm, I'll get around to suggesting that our existing arrangements don't work and can't be made to work quickly or consistently. I think we've seen that since Rwanda. You'll see some pictures that help illustrate the problem and the preferred option. Like many parents, I'll stress that our key to success is in being better prepared. We have to do more homework. Then, true to form, I'll suggest that you can also help too, and we need you, especially if you're smart or perhaps know people who need a worthy cause to donate some of their money. Tonight's format will be pretty simply show and tell. Some visuals on PowerPoint, interrupted by my questions and analysis. Later on, I hope you'll pose questions as well. So what long-standing challenges are sufficiently scary for anyone to miss Halloween? The prevention of armed conflict. It attracted a lot of attention, talk, and reports throughout the 90s. We heard about preventive deployment, about preventive action, but very little tangible action. To quote the UN report, A More Secure World, the biggest source of inefficiency in our collective security institutions has simply been an unwillingness to get serious about preventing deadly conflict, end quote. The second challenge, stopping genocide and mass atrocity crimes. Efforts took off after Rwanda, then the massacre in Srebrenica, but we haven't really seen anything new aside from another norm prohibiting atrocities. It's often tough to stop much with just a norm when you don't have an appropriate tool or service to deploy. That leads to the third challenge, which is closely related. In the responsibility to protect, we see a laudable series of principles, yet inappropriate means. Occasionally, in practice, even contradictions between the ends and the means available, which are mostly destructive, mostly straight-on military. And shock and awe shouldn't be seen as the best that we can do. We have an old traditional toolbox for an array of new complex jobs, so we really need to update our approach and refine our tools. Fourth challenge has been a long-standing one for the UN as well, rapid deployment to start operations. It remains an aspiration, but it's largely mission impossible at the moment. On average, it takes 4 to 6 months simply deploy a peacekeeping operation, which almost ensures that violent conflicts will escalate and spread. Fifth challenge is pretty critical as well, addressing human needs in areas where others cannot or will not. You probably are aware that millions of people are internally displaced in conflict zones around the world. Millions more are at risk as refugees. Frequently, they're in desperate need of help with shelter, sustenance, security, and hope. There are also new challenges leading to crises. Not sure whether anyone here has read Christian Parenti's new book, Tropic of Chaos, but he describes a contagion of crises, an environmental nightmare, which several defense establishments acknowledged 10 years back, but went on to argue they could cope with if they simply had more military means. So in response to those 5 long-standing challenges, we tried to develop a UN service that would at least help with each and provide assets useful in each. The first 5 challenges I listed are what we see as the primary roles of a UNEPS, and UNEPS was specifically designed to help with each. Responding to large-scale disasters, health and environmental crises might be considered ancillary tasks, which we also included in the composition, much the same way that Canada's Disaster Assistance Response Team is able to help organize a larger formation. We've included an array of small teams that should have a bigger impact. Now, what are we talking about specifically in this UNEPS? What's proposed? A permanent UN formation. A first responder that's available immediately. It has to be authorized by the Security Council. It should be multidimensional, composed of military, police, and civilians. Should be multifunctional, capable of responding to diverse crises. It must be pre-trained, well-equipped, ideally with about 16,000 personnel. And the composition really has to be gender equitable and regionally representative. What else? Well, what sort of structure and organization? We think it has to be co-located at a UN base under a static operational headquarters with 2 mobile field headquarters in an integrated modular formation that includes robust security elements, civilian police, skills and services of an array of civilians who can address human needs. What you see above is simply the organizational chart, the structure of a permanent UN base and operational level headquarters. Now, on this slide on the left, you'll see what may be considered an effective mobile brigade group. It's not designed for nor capable of warfighting, but it includes sufficiently robust elements to provide for self-defense, defense of the mission, and protection of civilians in most, if not all, cases. On the right, you should see the civilian and police elements deemed necessary for future integrated UN peace operations. Some assets like police, conflict resolution teams, human rights monitors, and educators, these are included to ensure the situation improves rapidly, that law and order are restored, that hope and help are provided, that peace builders are there to immediately engage in quick impact projects, and that all the efforts are sequenced for handover to those UN departments and others who will be rotated into the operation after 6 months. As indicated, UNEPS is simply a first responder. But if you get off to a good start, you can establish the basis for sound follow-on efforts to restore good governance and sustainable security. At least that's the hope. Designed for what? Well, in some respects, you can consider it similar to a UN 911, a lead service, first responder, one that complements existing arrangements. It should be capable of getting off and deployable within 48 hours if everything's pre-packed, pre-staged, and people are ready. It has to be competent in diverse crises, and it has to be cost-effective. I'll go into that shortly. Who says this should go, or who decides, and on what basis might a UNEPS be used? When should it not be deployed? Well, it's my understanding it should only really be reserved for complex emergencies, those that have the authorization of the UN Security Council. It has to have a clear and viable mandate with a reasonable expectation of success. There also have to be binding arrangements for making sure it's not left out alone, for augmenting it or even replacing it if necessary. There are even more criteria. There must be a really good reason, a just cause, a capacity to help, reasonable means to do the job, and as indicated, a fair chance of success. And if you plan to prevent the worst from happening, don't be late. You've seen definitions previously of emergencies and complex emergencies. One thing that they have in common is that they require a lot of prior preparation and organization if you're going to handle the situation effectively. At present, there's very, very little that militaries do to prepare to prevent armed conflict or to prepare to protect civilians. 95% of their preparation goes towards general purpose combat capability and preparing for war. It's a rather different job. Now, how do we assume to start something of this nature, or where would the people come from? Recruitment and selection of good people wouldn't be too hard. I'd like to be part of this if I was a little younger. A lot of bright students, even soldiers, asked me to hurry up and get it going so they might apply. The need, though, would be for individuals who actually volunteer to serve on the basis of merit and professionalism. They'd be selected much the same way the UN picks its own civil servants at the moment. You're going to have universal representation, and these would be people who volunteered but then become full-time paid employees of the organization and are there in a professional capacity to serve when needed. They would not have national political affiliation. They would be contracted and assigned, given extensive preparation and training, and a high assurance of reliability, readiness, commitment to the cause. We actually, in the Canadian study, thought that was reasonably doable. And I guess I should tell you, I began this back in 1995 in a joint foreign affairs and national defense effort to identify what might be required to make the United Nations capable of effective rapid deployment. At the time, we submitted our report to the UN General Assembly and then went on to launch a multinational initiative of 28 member states. Regrettably, the ground shifted under us and the political environment changed such that the institutional priority became NATO. And many northern governments were no longer inclined or willing to participate in UN peacekeeping. But that study that went to the General Assembly really was the basis of this UNEP's initiative and the ideas. At least it sparked our interest, and I had the benefit of some very bright military planners and UN officials, even Sergio Vera de Mella, Sir Brian Urquhart, Chris Coleman, and some outstanding Canadians like Colonel Jamie Hammond and others came in, drove long hours in from Petawawa, and were punished as a result of their contribution to this. But we were able to get it together sufficiently to recognize that the objective of UN volunteers and a dedicated standing rapid reaction capability was about the only way that we could assure a reliable rapid response. You couldn't get it from governments. Governments are only willing to commit to standby arrangements, which are conditional, which they tend to require 4 to 6 months to even negotiate. And because governments are very risk averse, they don't want to send their own people into harm's way. They don't even want their equipment to be rented to the UN frequently, unless at exorbitant costs. So while they may contribute to steady state peacekeeping in the best of circumstances, northern governments don't provide much for that anymore, but they definitely won't respond when there's an emergency or fast-breaking crisis. So the only way we're going to get this organized and up in any meaningful manner to prevent armed conflict and protect civilians is if we develop a dedicated permanent UN service. We've known that for a long time. The process for recruitment's pretty straightforward. Specific positions would simply be advertised worldwide. Individuals submit an application, go through a rigorous selection process, are vetted carefully, then given a short-term contract, hopefully one that leads to employment within this service. Why this specific model? Are there advantages? It should alleviate pressure on national governments. They wouldn't have to send their own people. It builds on and beyond the existing UN foundation. We look for a universal composition, hoping that we can ensure legitimacy. We provide necessary training, equipment, standards to ensure, if not elite, a very cohesive, sophisticated service for diverse tasks in prevention, protection, peace operations. We also assume it might help to offset a few other problems. If specifically trained for those protection and prevention tasks, it should be able to do a better job in managing mission startup, securing safe havens, guarding humanitarian corridors, countering spoilers and militias, restoring security, law and order, and improving the prospects for rapid deployment into harsh, even hostile environments. Now, it's that appropriate preparation for one's tasks that makes them more manageable. If you haven't rehearsed it and gone through it and done it and trained it and repeated it, then you're going to feel very discomforted by it. But with routine advanced training, protection of civilians and prevention of armed conflict shouldn't be all that challenging. National military establishments haven't to date tried it seriously. Why this model? I think I've mentioned that we're after a first responder for the initial 4 to 6 months of complex emergencies. We're looking at a modular formation that can be tailored to mission-specific requirements. We believe it's likely to be a cost-effective, sound investment for saving lives and money. The projected startup costs are approximately $2.5 billion. That's to put it all together. It's been estimated that our annual recurring cost is likely to be $1 billion as well. There may be even more costs for demanding deployments. But compare that to the annual peacekeeping budget of $8 billion, and yes, that does seem like a lot, but compare it to the annual military spending, which of the 15 most advanced countries is now $1.6 trillion and still going up. And UNEPS looks like a rather small investment. It's really only the cost of what Canada paid for 3 patrol frigates. They were $1 billion a pop. It's less than we pay for our strategic airlift in this country. This is not a major investment, especially when it's shared among 193 member states, some of whom have more money than Canada. I mentioned, I believe, that UNEPS would be gender equitable. It should be. There are really no decent excuses left. There have been excellent results from deployment of women peacekeeping formations. Are there any compelling reasons to suggest this idea might be better than what we currently do? I think one can make a pretty persuasive case that it would help to reduce the number of armed conflicts and war crimes, should help to reduce massive suffering and violent deaths worldwide, should definitely, if you're quick, help to reduce the need for those larger, longer peace operations. And I think, if you don't know, they're almost all for post-conflict stabilization now. The international community's pretty much given up on prevention or preventive deployment. So we get there late, and we have to have massive sized operations because conflicts have escalated, expanded, included more participants, more territory, and that means that the costs go up because they're there for longer. We all know an ounce of prevention can occasionally do the job. And we do think that this would help to reduce the high costs associated with current contemporary violent conflict and post-conflict reconstruction. If a UNEPS had been available, where might it have helped? I bet you can actually add to this list. We can only speculate on whether it might have helped to deter the bigger conflicts that we've seen in the past decade. It might have helped address problems in a few specific areas if it were available. Just by having the presence, you can deter, the same way that effective police deter aggression and crime. Bad leaders would know that there might be a capacity to respond. Hence, they might be inhibited modestly. But we do know that in several of the smaller cases, areas like the Ituri region in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, that crisis was addressed by a very small deployment of professionals. Similarly, in Sierra Leone, when peacekeepers were taken hostage, a very small deployment of elite soldiers was able to rescue them and get them out. And we know a small number of unique assets were able to stabilize a very volatile situation in Côte d'Ivoire. We also know from General Dallaire's estimate that 5,000 well-equipped troops might have been sufficient to stem a large part of the genocide in Rwanda. His plans were deemed to be sound by other senior military officers who reviewed them, yet Dallaire never received the help that he requested. Similarly, we suspect that the prompt deployment of a relatively discreet elite force might have been sufficient to discourage the massacres in Srebrenica. So we can cite a fair number of cases where this might have helped. That doesn't mean it would have been sufficient on its own. It just means that it might have saved a lot of lives and a lot of money. And it might have began a very encouraging process, one that governments have known they have to undertake at some point, but have been terribly reluctant to engage in. So let me ask, might there be any wider potential in this idea to start another promising peace process? Something that encourages wider disarmament and prompts a transformation of sorts. Yes, I think there is clear evidence to the effect that it could have that kind of effect. Governments have known of the requirements for a UN peace force for a long time. Just take a minute to reflect on this section of that 1961 US State Department document entitled Freedom from War. And it will tell you rather clearly that we've known we had to do this if we were going to, we had to build up the machinery for peace operations while gradually building down armed forces worldwide. It's quite a remarkable quote. It's available online. That document, the online version, has a cute little section in the bottom of it that says available for 15 cents. You begin to imagine how much money and how many lives they'd have saved if more people had read it. Millions of lives and trillions of dollars. And so, as might be expected, I believe the UNEP's idea and initiative have the potential to attract and mobilize people, organizations, and governments. With their support, we're going to develop partnerships, and we're already pulling together a global network of centers. Notably, people representing very diverse sectors in the North and the South agreed that the idea, the concept of an emergency peace service is far more appealing than the notion of a UN army or a rapid reaction force, that the case that's been presented from their perspective is more compelling. The model's more appropriate to addressing comprehensive integrated operations and especially complex emergencies. And as a result, some see that there may be more political potential in this. And on that point, can you imagine being a politician and simply getting up and saying that you're opposed to other people having emergency services? That might be a bit tough. Sorry?
Happens all the time.
Well, yes, in this city, you're right. But it might be also tough to say your citizens deserve a 911 response, but others elsewhere don't. It's not hard to say we don't need another army or force, but people have an affinity for services, especially when they're readily available when needed. This has been a global initiative for roughly 10 years, with a small number of NGOs moving it rather quietly. Occasionally it hits the newspapers. Once in a while it becomes a debate, but only on the periphery of General Assembly discussions. There are organizations in New York that are advocating for it. There are those in Pretoria, in Brazil, Sao Paulo, in Moscow, in Bradford, and an array of countries around the world. It has been an uphill struggle, and I'm willing to concede it's still probably not one you want to bank on. There's unique opposition, and you can imagine from where. Within academic circles, it's considered naive, idealistic, flaky, and therefore it tends to be rejected in Western academe. In military circles, it's considered blue sky thinking, vision-oriented, and a little worse than flaky. That's not the way it's seen in UN circles or in Southern military circles, but that's the case in the North. So after 10 years of hearing this isn't going up, but it's percolating around, there should be some lessons learned. This is one peace initiative among many. I guess at the forefront, this past 10 years has taught me more that process matters in a peace initiative, that nobody wants to participate if the initiative preferences some at the expense of others. Nobody wants to really engage in arguing for mission impossible over and over. And no peace initiative will fly if it's grounded in or associated with the structural violence of exploitation and exclusivity. Elitism and the new exceptionalism are probably the worst ways to begin on a peace initiative. In short, this process will have to improve. There are some easy to identify needs right off the top. Once ideas begin to attract opposition, you have to have really cogent, coherent arguments to deal with them, and we need a detailed blueprint that provides a serious review of what's needed at the political level, the strategic, operational, and tactical levels, and we need far better cost estimates that nail down really precisely what's required. Governments tend to always fudge that, and defense establishments tend to always lowball them so that military industries can do rather well by them, and they combine and collude to send those costs up. Getting pros to actually do the hard assessments of what's necessary down to the nuts and bolts and transport and vehicle fleets and salaries, that's a rather large job. So when looking at a blueprint of that nature, you're looking at really almost a multinational study. And therefore you need organizations or foundations willing to support the work. On outreach, educational outreach worldwide is no easy task. Yet we have expressions of interest from various universities, centers, institutes. I think I mentioned ideally these should be from a broadly representative grouping worldwide. Even at the start, we want to include and ensure that it doesn't look simply like another reformation of the UN Security Council. And we also have some historical considerations that perhaps matter. They explain partially why we're committed to this idea and this initiative for a UN Emergency Peace Service. Looking back, we know similar ideas only attract public support and high-level political interest in the aftermath of bad wars or genocides. I've mentioned that I started following Rwanda as part of a joint study. We really didn't have a clue of what we were doing back in 1993 and 94. By the time we did know, it was too late to offer a solution because the political environment had shifted to other priorities. This is very familiar also because there have been 7 to 8 occasions over the past 60, 70 years when we've come very close to having the political interest to push this sort of idea up. After World War II, the great powers were talking and planning. After the Korean War, they were at it again. After the Suez Crisis, they were at it again. After the Cold War, 3 of the permanent 5 members actually proposed a UN rapid reaction force. And after Rwanda, there was a brief period of 2 years where there was some chance to take it up, to push it, and make it happen. But having looked at those experiences, we know that that's a really brief window of opportunity. Governments usually scramble to initiate consultations and commence studies to determine what should be done. But by the time they have a sense of what might work, the interest has either dissipated or shifted such that anything ambitious is pushed off the table in favor of pragmatic incremental reforms to whatever they already do. Those tend to be insignificant baby steps that seldom work or help. So now with this initiative, our objective is to be prepared for the first time with an appealing idea and a small constituency of support before the next horrid crisis generates what might be considered a ripe moment. At least then, if we have a broad base of people from around the world backing a coherent plan, we should be in a better position to offer a plausible solution. And I think this is the first occasion in a long list of failed attempts to empower the organization in advance, such that it might fulfill its assigned tasks. I'm going to conclude with a quote from Sir Brian Urquhart, really the pioneer of peacekeeping. In his words, "This venture is of the greatest importance both to the UN as a responsible institution and to the millions as of yet unknown innocent victims who might in the future be saved by this essential addition to the UN's capacity to act on their behalf. There is one overwhelming argument for the United Nations Emergency Peace Service. It is desperately needed, and it's needed as soon as possible." Let me conclude by saying, good ideas don't work unless we do. Thank you.